Hello, everyone. This is Jennifer Schaus coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us in our Webinar Wednesday series. We host a webinar every Wednesday the entire year at 12 o'clock, and we've added, obviously, a 12:30 slot. Our speakers are industry experts, and that includes accountants, attorneys, other consulting professionals, and individuals who specialize in government contracting. All the webinars are complimentary. They're on our website under the webinar section. You can get the archived and the previously recorded ones from YouTube, our YouTube channel, or the archive webinar section on our site. In the interest of time, we don't take questions. So if you do have questions today about DCAA Audits or Don Kenonitz, you can contact him directly. His contact information is going to be on the last slide for you. A quick blurb about us. We're based in downtown DC and provide professional services for government contractors, both product and service companies of all shapes and sizes. We help large businesses with their subcontracting compliance and reporting, as well as proposal writing, GSA schedules, and other services that are listed there. We do have some networking events and conferences that we host throughout the year. You can find those on our website under the events section, and more information about us on the website. So without further ado, you've got some information and background here about Don Kenonitz, who is with Eric Cohen and Company CPAs. They're here local in the DC metropolitan area. Obviously, Don's got a tremendous amount of experience in government contracting. He's become a good friend and colleague over the last couple of years, and I'm sure he will educate everybody very well today on the DCAA audit. So Don, thanks for sharing your time and expertise today. I'm going to turn the controls over to you.
Okay, so if we can go to the first slide. I'm going to talk about these, 6 types of DCAA audits today. I'm going to concentrate on 2 that are of the most interest to the vast majority of government contractors, and they are of particular interest to fledgling contractors. And those are pre-award surveys and incurred cost audits. Any of you may encounter one or more of the others at some point, but most of you will encounter number 1 and 3 very soon during your tenure as a government contractor. So I'm going to spend the most time on those. So with that, we can start with pre-award surveys. Pre-award survey, let me before I go into what it involves, let me talk about why it's significant to government contractors. An increasing number of RFPs that come out on the street, and virtually any RFP that involves a cost-plus contract, will have a provision stating that you should submit with your proposal a copy of your most recent DCAA pre-award survey. And it will also typically stipulate that it can't be older than 5 years. So, we're in 2018 now, so if you haven't had one since 2013, you need to think about how you can get it updated. If you've never had one, you're going to get a little nervous. The question I probably get from more companies that encounter this the first time is, how do I get a pre-award survey? And there's a problem with that, because really, DCAA only acts at the behest of the contracting officer, i.e., the person who's issued the RFP or under whose auspices it's been issued, and he's the only one, he or she is the only one that can request a pre-award survey. So that poses a dilemma. That said, let me move into what it is. What it is it's a determination of a company's accounting system adequacy. And what I mean by adequacy is its adequacy for accounting for costs in accordance with certain essential things that the government requires, and those are really these. The government wants you to be able to distinguish between direct costs and indirect costs and unallowable cost. So your system needs to be able to distinguish those and to segregate them. It also needs to be able to accumulate direct costs, assign direct costs directly to contracts or subsets of contracts, such as tasks, contract line item numbers, sometimes called CLINs, and even sometimes a lower level element of the work. So that's number one. Second, it has to be able to accumulate indirect costs into logical pools, which you have to develop, and then to allocate those costs to the various contracts, tasks, etc., on the basis of an appropriate allocation base. And then finally, and it's typically done using a rate that's developed by taking the indirect cost pool and dividing it by base. So there are systems out there that are designed to do this automatically. The most common, the most popular, most well-known by far is the Deltek system. Back in the 90s, there were a couple of others, Jamis and Simpac. Today, you have more choices, especially if you're a small business. There's Procast, there's ICAT. Simpac is got an upgraded suite that's web-based, but a lot of people still use QuickBooks. And QuickBooks is not designed to be a government-compliant cost accounting system. It can be jury-rigged to pass the adequacy test, but I just want anybody to know that that's using it that it's going to require some effort to do that, and you probably will not know how to do it on your own. So anyway, many RFPs stipulate that you have to have a survey to propose. If you don't have one, technically only the CO has a request. However, sometimes RFPs allow CPAs to perform these pre-award surveys, and they're often known as an SF 1408 audit. And all that means is that we're talking about standard form 1408. If the DCAA were to do your pre-award survey, they would include that form as an attachment to their audit report. If an independent CPA were to do it, they also would attach it. And essentially, it's a checklist of things to look for. And I'm just going to have one open here, and I'll just read just a couple things. The accounting system provides for, and then you have a subset: proper segregation of direct from indirect costs, identification of cumulative direct costs by contract, logical, consistent method for allocation of indirect costs, accumulation of costs under general ledger control. Most of the stuff that I already talked about. One important one: a timekeeping system that identifies employee labor by both direct, intermediate, and final cost objectives, which is a fancy name for tasks and contracts and things like that. There was a period, briefly, I think it was in 2016 and 17, where DCAA was so far behind in auditing a more important batch of audits, incurred cost submissions, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that Congress actually passed a rule saying that DCAA could do no work for civilian agencies until it caught up on these. And during that period, CPA firms were being asked to do a lot of these. But this is still an alternative. If you don't have one, you're not going to probably be able to get one from this by having the CO direct it in time for your RFP. You can go to the bidders conference and ask the question, how can I get one? And perhaps the CO will provide a means. But as a last resort, you could go to a CPA and ask to have a SF 1408 audit done and then submit that and explain why you haven't yet had a pre-award survey, but that you're ready and willing to have one. As I said earlier, if you're using non-GC specific software, you're going to have some challenges passing the audit. The biggest problem with QuickBooks is it does not integrate any of those functions I spoke of earlier. You can't take QuickBooks and have it automatically allocate your indirect costs based on whatever pools you set up to contracts. You're going to end up having to do that offline with Excel spreadsheets. If you have it designed in such a way that the integrity is reasonably assured, you'll get through. And I've seen plenty of QuickBooks systems get through, but only with preparation. So post-award survey is similar to pre-award survey. It's simply the case that the CO has determined that it doesn't need it before it awards the contract. It'll be satisfied with doing it afterward. Typically, these will be where it's not cost plus. It might be time and materials, which is considered a flexibly priced contract, or it could be for a number of other instances. I'm not going to spend time on it because they don't present any special problem. If you could pass a pre-award survey, you can pass a post-award survey. And now we come to the big one, I think. Yes, incurred cost audits. All right, this is the most comprehensive DCAA audit. If you have any kind of flexibly priced contract, and let me step back a second. You might already be a government contractor. You might not have ever heard of an incurred cost audit, which means you'll probably never have submitted one. And you may not have submitted one because you're not required to. If you are required to, you want to get on it right away because there are very extreme negative consequences for failing to submit an incurred cost submission when it's due. So what is an incurred cost audit? Well, if you have flexibly priced contracts, and again, we're talking primarily about cost plus, there are certain T&Ms that automatically qualify as flexibly priced that require an incurred cost submission. And those would be T&Ms where you're getting some kind of a G&A rate or some kind of an allocated rate on top of your time and materials. You have to submit a detailed annual incurred cost submission. I'm going to refer to it as an ICS. If you are submitting it to DCAA, i.e. if you have DoD work, or if the DCAA has been named your cognizant auditor with a civilian agency, DCAA typically wants to get it in their format. They have at their website a massive Excel workbook full of macros, and they call it Incurred Cost electronically. And all that means is you download a copy of the workbook and you complete it. It has schedules for each pool, a lot of things that tie together via macros. I will tell you personally, I hate it. I think it's unwieldy. I think it's cumbersome. It was written some time ago and by individuals that I don't think to be particularly sophisticated when it comes to the use of Excel macros. So all kinds of colored blocks and all that. You are not required to submit it in that format, regardless of what someone may have told you, although you may be pressured to do so. I often advise clients to simply use a simpler template set up in Excel. Works exactly the same, but doesn't have all the macros, just that you can just use linking. But anyway, this submission is due. If you are required to submit it, it's due by June 30th of the year following the year for which you're submitting. So we just passed a month ago a deadline for people submitting their 2017 ICSs. It's a pretty big workbook. It's got a lot of schedules in it. They all have to tie back and forth. The purpose of it is that when you have a cost plus contract, your actual incurred costs, and this is typically going to be over a period of years, can't be known in advance, obviously. So you'll be granted something called provisional billing rates, and you'll use those billing rates to bill your contracts. You have to have some way of recovering your indirect costs from your customers in the interim between the time that you start the contract and you know your final rates, which is only known with history. DCAA has to audit your incurred cost submission before these final indirect rates can be approved. So, for example, in 17, you might have used a 20%, let me make it more realistic, a 30% fringe rate, a 40% overhead rate, and a 15% G&A rate for billing purposes. And those would have been approved going in. Now 2017 is over. You calculate your actual rates. They may be higher, they may be lower, but whatever they are, those are the rates on which your final billing will be determined. You can't use those until DCAA has audited them. They may have some disallowances, there may be some negotiation, but they are essential because you can finish a contract and you can't go back and calculate the actual amounts that are owed by each year without these audited final rates. And the reason I said DCAA was suspended earlier from doing work for civilian agencies for a period of time is because they were literally as much as 5 and 6 years behind on these audits. So contractors were screaming bloody murder because they couldn't final bill their contracts. They couldn't get money that was owed to them in many cases. So the incurred cost submission is complex whether you use the DCAA macro-loaded version or whether you put it together yourself. Systems like Deltek and Procast make an effort to print out all the schedules that in theory could form the ICS, but as a practical matter, usually require some manual manipulation But in any event, if you have not ever done one, it's probably worth getting some professional assistance. The old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth, and you know the rest of it. Timesheet floor-checks. There was a period where DCA believed that these provided their biggest bang for the buck. And the idea is that when employees keep their timesheets up to date daily, that is, they enter their time every single day, it leads to more accurate time capture. This was particularly true when companies were still using paper timesheets, and there are certainly some that still do that. But most of the software that's out there that's GC specific today, and I'm thinking of Deltek in particular because I would estimate that certainly 90% of larger contractors use it. And it has an electronic time reporting module. There's also a company out there called Uninet that has a web-based product for time reporting that interfaces with Deltek and a number of the others. But the important thing simply is that employees need to keep their time updated daily. We have the same issue in professional firms like my own, law firms. If you wait a week to put your time in, you're not going to remember everything you did. And that can be a problem. So accuracy is very important when a GC has flexibly priced contracts, in particular cost plus and T&Ms, because the accuracy of that time determines how much cost gets allocated to a particular contract. If you're working on a time and materials, you don't have an accurate timesheet, you may not really be tracking the right amount of time to that contract. So what is a floor check? Well, it's when DCA auditor shows up and talks to your receptionist and says, I'd like to talk to the CFO, COO, somebody, and says, I want to talk with a sample of your employees, and I will be asking them to produce their current timesheets on the spot to check and see if they're up to date. And if you're on paper timesheets, they'll ask to see those. The employee won't know what's coming. If they're done electronically, they'll ask the employee to open up the file and show that they've kept it up to date. If they find instances where this is not occurring, you will get a write-up and a warning, and you'll be asked to provide a remedial plan. We all know employees hate keeping up their timesheets. We've got real work to do, but this is something that you will see from time to time. I think electronic timekeeping seems to have diminished somewhat DCA's interest in this, but they still do them. So we go from there to estimating system. The purpose of this is to see if you have a system that's adequate for providing reliable cost data in proposals that have to have that data. Now, much has changed since the 90s. In the 90s, the government passed something called the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, FASA. Prior to that, it was common for contracting officers to ask for cost data on virtually every proposal. And they used the excuse, I'll call it an excuse, that the government buys many things that there's no other market for. A6 attack fighters, for example, and that therefore and since there's no competition, no serious competition, there's typically one or two suppliers that can provide that kind of thing, that it needed to know the contractor's cost and its proposed profits to adequately review whether or not the government was being treated fairly. So an estimating system obviously becomes of tremendous importance when you're having to supply these costs. It's of lesser significance now because so much stuff is sold on the GSA schedule. The government is not allowed to ask for certified cost and pricing data under when any number of exemptions are present in an RFP situation, the biggest one being adequate competition, which is defined as two or more contractors who are able to do the work, and that gets met a lot. So you don't see as much of this. It's typically performed on larger companies that have both a high volume of cost plus proposals and also they're companies that are looking for what we call forward pricing. They do so much work with the government, and their indirect rates are so stable that the government essentially examines their estimating system and then says, look, we're just going to enter into a forward pricing agreement with you, and we'll agree on these rates going forward, and then we won't argue about them after that. If you regardless of whether you're a likely candidate for an audit of an estimating system, it pays to have a written estimating policy manual that talks about the procedures you go through in estimating your costs. A lot of times that can be referenced directly in the proposal, and it's very useful, even if you just want to extract from it sections that may be relevant to an RFP where the government will ask about how you estimate your costs, whether they do it in requesting the RFP itself or at a later stage when you're negotiating with them or being asked for, say, a BAFO, best and final. So estimating systems are important, and usually you're going to need some assistance probably in writing a good manual. And I think that brings us to certified purchasing system reviews. These are not particularly common. There are specific thresholds where the government is required to get them. Essentially, what the government is looking at is, what is the system you use for purchasing? If you use a high volume of subcontractors, or if you buy a high volume of materials for contracts, the government wants to make sure that you're getting the best price on those subcontracted and services or goods and materials, because those costs are being, if not passed through to the government, they're certainly being incorporated into the price you're proposing to the government, even for a fixed price contract. These are technically performed by the Defense Contract Management Agency, but DCAA participates in them. They're supposed to get a DCAA auditor to participate. They're looking to see if you have an adequate purchasing system. There's a handbook for this that you can actually download from a government website. And essentially, it lists about 23 or 24 characteristics that the auditor is to look for, an audit team actually, to look for in determining whether you have an adequate purchasing system. If you're subject to one of these, or even if you're not, having a certified purchasing system is sort of a mark of gold, because you can put that in your proposals, and you can say, I have a certified purchasing system. It's been reviewed by DCMA and DCAA, and that will take you a long way in terms of establishing credibility of your competitors. But getting through one of these, or preparing for one of these, requires some pretty sophisticated in-house financial capability, or else outside assistance. It's not something that's done routinely. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Jennifer, where do we go from here?
So, Don, thanks for some great information there. Obviously, you know your stuff on DCAA. If anybody has questions for Don, either about his presentation, or if your company is getting ready to go through some sort of audit, or you want to have Don help you set up a compliance system, please reach out to him. His phone number is here at 301-917-6247, and you've got his email there as well. Again, he is with Eric Cohen CPAs. They're in the Rockville area, if I'm not mistaken. Next week, we are covering effective compliance programs at 12 o'clock, and then 12:30, we will walk through the steps for SDVO certification, service disabled, veteran owned. Don, thanks again for a great presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who joined us today for the webinar series. And we'll talk to you next Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.